Hola, ¿qué tal? Soy Andrés Vázquez y bienvenidos a Imago Day. En esta oportunidad estaré conversando, entrevistando con el doctor Max Baker-Hytch. Él es profesor de filosofía en la Universidad de Oxford. Estaremos hablando un poco sobre el trabajo que viene realizando en el ocultamiento divino. También se hablará un poco sobre los argumentos que hay a favor de la existencia de Dios, como también un poco hablaremos sobre el problema del mal, entre otros temas relacionados a este. Así que los invito a que ustedes puedan suscribirse, si les gusta la entrevista, darle like y poder compartir con aquellas personas que tienen dudas sobre los temas que estaremos tocando el día de hoy. Well, welcome, Max, for being here. Thank you for accepting this interview.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Max Baker-Hytch, he received his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University in 2014. He is a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University, and is a member of the philosophy faculty at Oxford University. He is also senior academic tutor at the OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. Max has published scholarly articles on various topics within the philosophy of religion and is currently working on a book on divine hiddeness. So before we start talking about these topics, start with the interview, I would like to hear a little bit about your testimony. How did you become a Christian?
Yeah. So I became a Christian when I was about 20 years old. So that's about 13 years ago now. I grew up in a loosely Christian home, I would say. So my parents did take me to Sunday school when I was younger, but I think by the time I was a teenager, I largely lost interest in Christianity. I may occasionally have prayed a sort of prayer to God that, if I wanted something, I would maybe pray a bit like almost as if God was a vending machine in the sky. But then by the time I was sort of 17 or 18, I wasn't really interested at all. And to some extent, I was actually quite hostile to Christianity. And I wouldn't say I was ever an atheist as such. I was probably more just of an agnostic. But then that changed significantly when I went to university. So I did my undergraduate degree at Exeter University in the UK. And in my halls of residence, or you might say dorms, there was a group of Christians. And I got to know those Christians, and I hadn't really ever before met people who were both really serious about their faith and could also kind of start to engage some of the intellectual questions I had. And so that was quite intriguing to me. And actually, there was a CU, a Christian Union Events Week at my university, and the Christian Union brought in various guests, people who would kind of have conversations with seekers and so on, people who were interested. And there was one person in particular who was a medical doctor. He had recently qualified, and and he was just really patient and would be willing to take the time to engage with some of the sort of intellectual questions I had. That maybe I before had thought that Christians didn't really have answers to these questions, but this guy was just really patient, and I think it definitely changed my attitude, just seeing that actually, there are Christians who've thought things through and who are trying to give robust and intellectually satisfying answers. And so, to cut a long story short, I started reading stuff for myself. I started in particular reading around a bit on the historical evidence for the reliability of the New Testament, for Jesus' resurrection. And I also started reading around on the sort of philosophical arguments for God's existence. And I think there wasn't necessarily a particular date that I could pinpoint, but it was a process that happened over the course of a few months. And ever since then, really, I just had this passion for helping people who have intellectual questions about Christian faith, people who would, in a sense, like to believe in God, but feel that their intellect gets in the way. And I just had this passion to help those people. And so I think that drove me to go deeper in philosophy. Then, yeah, I did my master's in philosophy, then went to Oxford for my PhD. And yeah, and I think ever since then, I've really been holding together these sort of two tracks. So on the one hand, academic philosophy, and as you said, I still publish scholarly articles in philosophy, especially in philosophy of religion, and I teach at Oxford University. But I also am engaged in kind of apologetics ministry.
Great. I believe that apologetics is important because it can impact the life of many teenagers when they begin to have doubts about their faith. Well, I know you are writing a book on divine hidenness. What can you tell us about it? You know, the common question, if God exists, why does he hide? This is one of the most frequent questions of atheists. How do you answer this?
Yeah, well, I think it's a not just a philosophical question, but also a deeply personal one for many people. So I think the way I would approach it is by distinguishing two basic questions. So one is the question of why isn't God just so obvious that you can kind of see him right there? Why isn't he so obvious that honest doubt about God is impossible? So that's one question. The second question, which is actually the one that's more my focus in the work that I'm doing on hiddenness, is the question of, okay, let's suppose that there is some reason why God is, let's say, his existence is veiled. There's some reason why God chooses to not be so in your face obvious that you couldn't possibly doubt. But then there's a question of, well, why is it that the glimpses of God's existence, the clues, the evidence which arguably points towards God, why is it that not everyone has equally good access to that evidence, right? So that's the question I'm especially interested in. But let me first say a bit about that first question of why is it the case that God isn't just in your face obvious? Why can't we kind of see him? That's almost the very childlike question that probably all of us have asked. If there's a God, where like literally where is he? Why can't we touch and see him, and so on? So I mean, there's a lot of things you could say about that, and I'll just offer a couple of brief thoughts. So I think when we ask that question, of why isn't God so obvious that we couldn't possibly doubt, I think we have in mind some idea of what God is aiming at. So I think we're thinking, well, God wants everyone to believe in him. So why doesn't he? He's all powerful. Why doesn't he just make himself really obvious so that there isn't any issue? Everyone just believes in him. Now, I think the problem is that actually it's a bit more complicated than that in terms of what God is aiming for. The biblical picture is of a God whose overarching aim when it comes to human beings is to have relationship with human beings. And so it actually may not be as straightforward as saying that, well, God should just make himself so obvious we couldn't possibly doubt. And I think there's two things that come up here when we're thinking about the idea of a personal relationship between an infinite, all-powerful God and finite, limited human beings. So one is that very issue of the power, the difference in power, the kind of imbalance, that huge imbalance of power there. And I think one way to get at this is with a sort of story or parable that the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard told. And the story goes like this. There's a king, and he fell in love with a maiden. and he wants to win her over, but he knows that if he goes to her dressed as the king, so that she knows, you know, he's the king, he's mighty over this kingdom, he knows that if he does that, then her response to him could well be a response of fear and coercion rather than a response of love. And so what he does is he disguises himself in the outfit of a peasant, and then he goes to her and he wins her heart. And so then he knows that her response to him is a true response of love. It's not a response that comes from fear or coercion. And the point of the story, I think, as it applies to divine hiddenness, is just to say that the power imbalance between humans and God is so enormous that if God was to manifest himself in a way that was so abundantly obvious, we couldn't doubt it. It seems quite likely that our response to God would not be a response that came from love necessarily, but could very easily be a response that comes out of fear or coercion. And so God can't disguise himself as something other than he is, but he can make it so that his existence is somewhat hidden, is somewhat ambiguous. And in that way, he doesn't kind of overpower us. As the French mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal put it, there is enough light for those who want to see, but enough darkness, enough shadows for those who don't. And in that way, God allows us to respond to him in a way that isn't coerced or forced. So I think that's what I mean, there's a huge amount more that one could say, but that's the beginnings of what I would want to say about the general problem of why isn't God more obvious.
This is definitely one of the topics that can be talked about for hours and hours. This is a common question, I think. When people begin to struggle with their faith, it is precisely because they don't see any answer from God. Now, I would like to talk about the arguments in favor of the existence of God. Many people believe that there are no arguments in favor of God, but which argument is the strongest for you?
Yeah, well, before I say exactly which are my favorite ones, I should just say, I mean, I think that there really has been a kind of revolution in philosophy, especially in I suppose predominantly Britain and America in the last 50 years. There really has been a renaissance of very serious theistic philosophy. So figures like Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, Robert Adams, Peter Van Inwagen, William Lane Craig, Brian Leftout. So these are really top scholars at the top universities in the world. And, you know, I think it would have been easy in the middle of the 20th century to think that the arguments for God's existence had been consigned to the history books, as it were, that these arguments had been refuted once and for all. But actually, I mean, there has now been a huge amount of work done by philosophers at the cutting edge of this work, showing actually that both these arguments avoid many of the historically prominent objections to them, and also that there are many ways in which new discoveries in science, discoveries in logic, and in probability theory can actually enhance these arguments and show them to be even more impressive than they were once thought to be. So in terms of the different arguments, I mean, I would say one way you can think about it is that there are several families of arguments. Sometimes people talk about the cosmological argument, but actually there are lots of different cosmological arguments. There isn't just one cosmological argument. So I think we could talk about several families of arguments for the existence of God. So one argument, and possibly the most kind of abstract type of argument, most difficult in some ways to get your head around, would be ontological arguments. So I think the best and most interesting versions of ontological arguments are what are called modal ontological arguments, which So if you've come across the ontological argument, a common sort of objection that I think used to be thought to be kind of decisive was to say, well, this idea that a being would be greater if it existed in reality than just as an idea. That's a sort of summary of Anselm's ontological argument. The idea was, well, that's a fallacy because existence isn't an attribute that something has or lacks. Well, whatever we want to say about that sort of objection doesn't apply to the latest and I would say best ontological arguments, because what these they're known as modal ontological arguments. What these arguments want to say is that the thing that it's not that we're saying that the idea of a perfect being is lesser than the reality of a perfect being, so that that a perfect being that exists in reality is greater. Rather, we're saying that actually a being that exists necessarily is greater than a perfect being that exists necessarily is greater than a perfect being that exists only contingently. That, in other words, that could have not existed. And so these kinds of arguments avoid that kind of historical objection to ontological arguments. And actually most philosophers today, including atheists, would accept that there is a version of the ontological argument that is logically valid. It doesn't have any fallacy in it. The question then is more around one of the key premises. It's the premise that says that it's possible that a perfect being exists necessarily. That's where the debate is around now. But everyone really, well, not everyone, but I would say most people in this debate agree that the modal ontological argument is logically valid. Now that's one family. Another family would be cosmological arguments, of course. And cosmological arguments will start from some very general feature of existence. So they might start from the fact that there is change, that there are events in the world. So one thing is caused to change by another thing, and the thought being, well, this has to stop somewhere. There has to be a being that is the cause of change, but itself doesn't change. And these are the kinds of arguments you get historically from Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. But then you also get different kinds of cosmological arguments, especially the one that William Lane Craig has really revived and done a lot of work on, which says that the fact that the universe, not just that it exists, but that crucially that it began to exist, that this is something that needs explanation, and that God is the best explanation for it. Then, of course, there are moral arguments which talk about the idea that there seem intuitively to be some moral obligations we're under that are objective. So then they're not just cultural constructs. So that it's immoral to torture children for fun. That seems to be objectively true. It's not just culturally constructed. And so the thought is that, according to some moral arguments, the existence of objective moral obligations is better explained by a conscious being who is the author of that moral law, as opposed to just saying that these objective ethical truths just exist, just kind of as a brute fact. And then we could talk about design arguments. And of course, these have a long history. Famously, William Paley in the 18th century compared the universe to a watch. Now, obviously, there have been various critiques of Paley's argument, particularly the way he focused on certain features of the biological world, which he claimed couldn't be explained except by a designer. But actually, I would say the most interesting and exciting kind of design argument today is the argument from fine-tuning, which points to the fact that, according to modern physics, there are various features of the universe that were kind of balanced on a knife edge. So things like the gravitational constant, how strong the force of gravity is, as just one example. And if that value of the gravitational constant had varied by just one, I think something like 1 part in 10 to the power 60, then gravity would have been either too strong or too weak for there to have been galaxies, stars, and planets. And so there's many, many other examples of fine-tuned features of the universe. And the thought is that, you know, these fine-tuned features are extremely unlikely on the hypothesis of chance, whereas they're much more likely on the hypothesis of a designer who wanted the universe to have life-sustaining properties. And then, and I should say there are other types of design arguments too. But then finally there are, and actually possibly one of my favorite kinds of arguments, arguments from mental phenomena. So that's to say, from features of consciousness. So there's the argument from consciousness, which says that the existence of a first person point of view, the fact that there is conscious experience, there's, you know, what it's like to taste coffee, what it's like to see red. This seems to be something fundamentally different from third person descriptions of the world, which talk about, you know, chemical and electrical processes in the brain. And actually, many secular philosophers of mind would say that what's known as the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining why is it that these brain processes, electrical firings in the brain, which can be captured very nicely in third-person descriptions in neuroscience, why is it that these are accompanied by this really different thing, you know, first-person conscious experience? And many secular philosophers of mind would say that the first-person conscious experience cannot be captured by a third-person description. Even if we can say that, you know, there's this really tight correlation between what's going on in the physical brain and the first-person conscious experiences someone is having. Even so, that doesn't mean that the first-person conscious experience in any way reduces to or is explained by the physical third-person description. And so arguments from consciousness start from observations about the character of consciousness, and argue that consciousness is something that is not something that we would really expect to find in a naturalistic universe where physics is kind of the base layer of reality. But it is something that we would expect to find in a universe where at kind of rock bottom is a conscious mind. And so, yeah, those kind of 5 families of arguments, I would say, are probably where the most sort of interesting cutting edge work is being done today.
Wow, we do have enough arguments to support the existence of God. As you were sharing this list of arguments for the existence of God, I was thinking that there are people who can tell you, okay, there's an intelligent mind behind everything. There's a creator, but this doesn't mean that this creator is the Christian God. You know, the question will be, how will you go from the existence of God to Christianity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the way I would do it is, I mean, I think the Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne has a way of laying this out, which I think is particularly helpful. So what he says is, look, suppose that we've got some evidence for the existence of God, and let's kind of let's sort of park that conversation for now. Suppose that we do have some reason for thinking that there's a personal being who created and sustains the universe. So what might we? So it seems as though there's at least an even chance that God would want to communicate with human beings. And what might we be looking for What might be the hallmarks of a communication from God? Now, there's presumably a few ways God could do this. God could kind of write in the sky, something like that. But, I think I've suggested some reasons why we might not expect God to do that, because that would kind of be so overwhelmingly obvious if the stars spelled out, I am the God of the universe and so on. That wouldn't really leave any room for doubt whatsoever. So on the other hand, God might communicate through a human being. And so Richard Swinburne suggests that there's a few things we might look for. Certainly we would look for a certain kind of moral character. We would expect that if this human being was, in some sense, the vehicle of God's communication to humanity, we would certainly expect that human being to have had a profound influence on the subsequent history of the world. We would expect that human being to have given a certain kind of very profound ethical teaching, and we would also expect maybe that God might put some kind of signature on that person's life, something that only God could do. And Swinburne's argument is that when we look at the various candidates, I mean, there really aren't very many when you start to think about figures in human history who are in that kind of category of profound spiritual moral teachers who have had an enormous influence over subsequent human history. I mean, it's really actually just a very small handful, but then it really does seem as though Jesus is the best candidate. I mean, by the way, some secular sociologists did a study that used various kinds of algorithms to try and estimate who had had the biggest influence in human history. And they concluded that Jesus of Nazareth had the biggest influence by a pretty massive margin. There's not really even kind of much dispute about that in terms of the way that they kind of set this up. And they certainly weren't looking for that result. So Jesus already looks like a plausible candidate for the sort of vehicle of God's communication to humanity. But then I think when we actually delve into the narratives about Jesus that we find in the biographies of Jesus, what are known as the Gospels, I want to suggest that the way a combination of things, the kind of teaching he gives, the command to love your enemies, the command to forgive in this really radical way. This kind of teaching that Jesus gives, even many atheists I know think that Jesus' teaching is profound and admirable. But it's not just that. I think there's also something about the way that he embraced the outsider, he embraced the marginalized. The way he treats women actually is really striking, I think. There are other kind of religious figures, other even founders of religions, where when you look at the way they treat women, you kind of have to say, well, at best, that was a man of his time. But with Jesus, when you see how he treats women, you don't have to make any kind of excuse. The way he treats women is just with complete dignity and respect. And so it really does seem as though Jesus not only gave this amazing ethical teaching, which as I said, many secularists, atheists find to be profound and to be very worthy of our consideration, but also just the way he treated human beings, the way he treated women, the way he treated outcasts. But then finally, and this thing that Swinburne says, is there some kind of signature on his life that looks like it's the kind of thing that only God could do? And this is where we kind of get into the question of the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And I think you said to me that you've interviewed Mike Licona, so I won't kind of delve into that deeply, but all that, to cut a long story short, there's several facts which would be accepted by a broad majority of historians, including that Jesus' disciples, the people who knew him and followed him for 3 years, really were convinced that they saw Jesus alive and interacted with him on occasions after his death, including when they were together as a group. A bit more disputed, but still, I think a majority of historians would agree that Jesus' tomb was found empty shortly after his death, and also that Saul of Tarsus, this figure who started out hating the early Christians, did a kind of radical 180-degree about turn. And became, in many ways, one of the most energetic advocates of Christianity, again, because he claimed that he saw the risen Jesus. And so, again, these things contribute to this picture of this figure who looks like, when you take it all together as a package, this person, Jesus of Nazareth, if anyone in human history is God incarnate, it seems like Jesus is the best candidate for that. And so I think that's probably how I would approach the issue of how do we get from theism to Christianity.
Wow, the part you mentioned about Jesus, or how Jesus treats women, is interesting. And it's funny because nowadays some groups will say or claim that religious, or specifically Christianity, is against women. However, you see that this is not the case when you notice the way Jesus treated women. In fact, Christianity was attractive to the women of the first centuries, precisely because it dignified them, gave them value at a time when they were despised. I wrote an article about Lilith. I don't know if you heard about it. Lately, I have seen on the internet that the idea that Lilith was the first wife of Adam, and this idea has been going viral over the internet. But just because her character, God didn't like it and created another more submissive woman, that is Eve. And well, these people said that the church didn't want people to know about this, and which is why we don't find this story in the Bible. Anyway, just rumors from the internet. But my point is that some people use this to say that Christianity oppressed women. Like you said, Jesus dignified them, dignified woman. Furthermore, human beings have the same value in being created in the image of God. And well, what you said made me think a little bit about this topic.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think actually it's, there's many ways in which people can legitimately point to Christians, people who have called themselves Christians throughout history, who have behaved in extremely oppressive ways. And I think Christians shouldn't try to downplay that. We should just be upfront about the fact and admit that, yes, there have been some quite dark episodes in the history of Christianity. And yet, and I think that, I think people can understand this, there's a sense in which that critique, the reason that critique is so kind of poignant is precisely because people realize that, well, you're claiming to follow this Jesus who seems to be the embodiment of everything that's the opposite of these oppressive behaviors. And I think so almost what I'm saying is, in that question is a recognition of the discord between someone claiming to follow Jesus and doing things that are really oppressive and horrendous and that marginalize other human beings, because Jesus himself was the embodiment of the opposite of all of those things. And a friend of mine put it like this, that actually he was talking about the issue of Christian the Crusades and religious violence done in the name of Christianity, and the way he put it was that the Crusaders, they did what they did not because they didn't take not because they took Jesus too seriously, not because they were too fanatical about Jesus and about Jesus' teaching and his way, but because they weren't taking Jesus seriously enough.
Yes, I believe that an honest search for truth will lead you to Christianity. In my case, for example, I was an atheist, but I have always been interested in researching about these issues. I spent time researching about Islam, Judaism, and some other religions, and also Christianity. And I consider, at least in my case, that all the evidence points that Christianity is true.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, you know, obviously it's difficult to, in the short time we have, to really go into the comparisons between Christianity and the other major religions. But I really do think that when you don't even have to go that deeply into the historical evidence, for example, to see that the earliness of the documentation, the extent to which it's corroborated by external sources in archaeology. For Christianity, it's just much more solidly attested than for example, for Islam, where the sources are much later than the life of Muhammad, and there's kind of fairly massive discrepancies between the things that those sources about Muhammad's life say and the you know, the geography of the places where he was supposed to live. There seems to be enormous kind of mismatches. And so, yeah, I think it all just contributes to a picture of when you actually dig into this stuff, whether through philosophy or history. Yeah, I certainly would agree with you that I think Christianity stands up much better.
Well, now I would like to move to another topic, to one of the major objections of Christianity, which is the problem of evil. What answer could you give to the problem of evil? You know, if God exists, why then exists also evil and suffering in the world?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I should start by saying I don't think I would want to claim to have a full and complete answer. Um, yeah, it definitely is one of the biggest intellectual challenges to belief in God. So let me first say that I think we don't need to know the reason why God allows evil in order to be able to trust God. What we need to know is that, firstly, our suffering can be meaningful. Secondly, that it's defeatable. That's to say that there will be an end to it and that it can be redeemed. Somehow, good can be brought out of it. And thirdly, that someone is going through it with us. Someone's there with us who knows what it's like. Now, I'll come back to those 3 points. Now, with that said, I think we do have some ideas about what sorts of reasons God might have in general. I think we're much more in the dark when it comes to particular cases of suffering. Why did this person have to go through that? But in terms of general types of evil, I think we have some ideas. So some of the some contemporary philosophers like Richard Swinburne, Peter Van Inwagen, would talk about higher order goods. So these are goods, things like, for example, grace, forgiveness, courage. These things seem like really valuable things, and yet they are the kinds of things that can only exist against a backdrop of adversity and suffering. And what's more, it seems like some of the best goods almost require, or it's impossible for them to exist except for in the context of horrendous evils. So, but as I said, I would fully want to acknowledge we don't know exactly why God allows evils. And it gets particularly hard when we ask, why does God allow this particular kind of evil? And so let me suggest that the Christian story has those 3 points I made earlier, the 3 things that I think we yearn to know when we're in the midst of suffering. Let me suggest that the Christian story has something unique to say to all 3 of them. So firstly, this question of how can our suffering be meaningful? the Christian story says that God became human and died in order to redeem us and all of our sufferings. And so, so our suffering can be taken up into this bigger story, and somehow, and it may be that we just don't have any glimpse really of how this works, not this side of the grave, but somehow the sufferings in our lives can be redeemed and good can be brought out of them. The second thing is that the Christian story says that evil will be defeated. The world won't always be in this state of containing all this suffering. There will be a point at which God comes and draws this this kind of broken reality to a close and remakes it new. And then the third thing is that, you know, this question of, is there someone going through it with me? Well, according to Christianity, God has come in human flesh and has experienced human life firsthand at its very worst. So it would be a bit like, so I have two small girls, and suppose that one of them had to have some blood taken, and they were really scared about it, and they didn't understand why. It was really frightening. I couldn't explain to her why this had to happen. But what I do is come down beside her, hold her hand, and I even have the same procedure done to me. I have some blood taken from me as well, so she can see I'm going through the same thing that she is. And that is at the heart of the Christian story, that God has been through what we are going through. God knows what it's like firsthand to suffer as a human being. And then the final thing to say, the cross, that's to say Jesus hanging naked, humiliated, bloody on the cross. To every onlooker at that point in time, all his disciples and his followers, that would have looked just like the most pointless evil of all, just the most gratuitous, pointless waste. It would have just looked like nothing good can come of this awful situation. This nobody of a man being deserted by his friends, mocked and tortured. And yet, in reality, it was the greatest thing in the whole history of the world. And so almost we get this glimpse into how what looks like the most horrendous, pointless waste can actually, the way in which God can actually radically redeem even what looks like the most gratuitous evil in history. And so I think what I want to say is that on the one hand, yeah, I think we have some ideas, philosophically speaking, about, well, what, you know, sorts of goods might God be aiming at, where these goods are the kind of things you just can't have except in a world of suffering. We have some thoughts about that, but definitely I don't think that will be completely satisfying. But what we have in the Christian story, I would say uniquely, is this claim that God God knows what it's like to suffer firsthand. God goes through it with us and promises that evil will one day be defeated.
Well, before we finish with the interview, I know that you got to know Rabbi Zacharias. We know that he's now with the Lord, and I wanted you to share with us a little bit about Rabbi's legacy.
Yeah, so I think one thing that really stands out to me is that, you know, I think apologetics can be this really cerebral thing where it feels like it can be it can feel like an exercise in almost like the way lawyers build a case, and it's this quite dispassionate kind of affair of you know, say, oh, this premise doesn't work, you know, this is a fallacy here, and so on. And you know, of course, I'm a philosopher, and so I obviously think that stuff is extremely important. But I think that what was really distinctive about Rabbi's approach to apologetics was that he saw the human being who was asking the question. And he saw that it's not just about kind of you know, unpicking their intellectual objections, and then as if that would be kind of bring them over the threshold to faith. But actually it was about seeing that person as a human being who is made in God's image and whom God loves, and actually and almost kind of ministering to that person. And so it was that combination of the head and the heart that I think Ravi had. And I would also just say that I think this is something that you wouldn't, I mean, I think you do see this in the way he answers questions, but the thing that most people would never realize is the amount of time Ravi would just spend with people after the talk is finished, just interacting with them personally after after the cameras have turned off, and just the care and attention he would give to all sorts of different people, whether it was even, you know, someone who just drove him in a taxi to his talk. The kind of the way he saw the person was just really amazing, and I think is an inspiration to everyone who's interested in apologetics.
Well, thank you, Dr. Max, for being here. It has been a great pleasure to have you here at the channel in Imago Dei.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be with you, and yeah, thanks again for having me.
So I hope you can come back soon to the channel so we can have another great interview with you. So thank you again for being here. Así que, amigos, ya saben, espero que les haya gustado la entrevista, que hayan podido disfrutar. Hemos tenido al doctor Max Baker aquí. Y si les ha gustado, por favor, regálenme un like y compartan con los amigos, con personas que tengan dudas acerca de estos temas. Así que ya saben, y nos vemos pronto. Hasta luego.